Before we start, I will do short introduction again. We have Jason Mornigstar with us, who is a game designer behind Fiasco, Night Witches, Grey Ranks, and many, many other games aside from that. And he's, for me especially, a very special guest because he's crossing the boundaries between the LARP and tabletop games, which I value very much. And I'm very, very happy that he is here with us. So, off to you, Jason.
Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. So I'm going to talk about tabletop design principles. This is a little bit of a higher level talk. I'm going to introduce some concepts and give examples. So I want to talk about game design concepts in a sort of high level way. I'm going to talk about some cool games, and then if we have time at the end, we can have a conversation, or we can wait for the Q&A. I've given this talk before. I often give it to people who are making digital games. And so in some ways, it is a sales pitch for tabletop games and LARPs as a useful design practice. So we're talking about analog games. And analog is great. Analog handles emergence, the idea that unexpected things are going to happen. And it handles that gracefully and effortlessly. That's something that digital games have a harder time with sometimes. And also creative collaboration is built into the format, which is, again, exciting and cool. So as human beings, we have an innate set of skills, ways that we communicate, and analog games work great with those. They integrate seamlessly with those. Analog games are iterative. They're easy to update, to modify, to change. They're extensible. They're easy to build upon. And they're pretty much pure social fun. So I know that I'm talking to an audience who already appreciates these things, but just know that what we do is special and really, really unique and cool. So you're building a tabletop role-playing game. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm really talking about tabletop. Most of what I say, I think, applies to live action role play as well. And I can address that to some degree. And certainly in the Q&A, I would love to be challenged on how these apply to live action. But the talk is mostly focused on tabletop. And all my examples, except a few, will be tabletop examples. So let's talk about about-ness. The idea that your game is about something. So it's very easy to talk about a game in terms of its setting and situation. We are a bunch of superheroes protecting the city from villains. Well, that's setting and situation. But really what your game is about is theme and premise. It would be very easy to have two games about a bunch of superheroes protecting the city from villains that are wildly different in theme and wildly different in premise. So the superhero game that I might make the heroes miserable, bad people who are burdened with responsibility and are acting out in ways that are completely inappropriate. And the theme of that game is that power destroys you. It's very different from a very clean and shiny game about how with great power comes great responsibility, right? It's two different games with different themes and premises with the same situation in the same setting. So think about what your game is about. It's also important to think about the actual people playing your games. It's not uncommon for me to see a game or to read a game that just doesn't seem reasonable. It's either presented in a way that's difficult to understand, or the game itself just doesn't seem to think about what actual people do when they play a game. So it's important to keep in mind that real people are going to play your games and that you want to build them in such a way that real people will be able to. Now, so you've got a game that's about something. It's got theme, it's got premise. Real people are going to play that game, and you have ideas about how that's going to happen. And where those two things meet is where things get really interesting. So let's talk about system for a second. So there's a principle called the Lumply-Care principle that you might hear about if you really get into game design nerd world. And the Lumply-Care principle is system is defined as the means by which the group agrees to imagined events during play. And if you think about that, that's a very broad definition. Often when people talk about system, they're talking about how the dice work. And what are the things that you write down on a character sheet. And the Lumply-Care principle suggests that system is much bigger than that. That it includes the social contract. It includes how you agree to interact. It includes who gets to say what and when. It includes all kinds of things. At its most extreme, it includes who has to order the pizza. So system is very broad if you think about it in this way, which I do. I think it's important that we think about it. And if you're thinking about real people playing your game, then having a very broad definition of system is very useful. So what happens when and who decides, right? That's part of system. That's really what it's getting at. And there's another principle, the Sega principle, and I believe Paul is going to be joining us tomorrow for a panel discussion, so you can ask him more about this. But that principle is that if the same person generates their adversity and also its resolution, the result is boring. And you want to avoid that. So if you look at, for example, Fiasco. In Fiasco, when it's your turn, you get to establish what's happening, or you get to resolve what's happening, but you never get to do both. And that's because if you got to do both, it would be boring. It's fine to break this rule, but you want to be very conscious about what you're doing, and you want to be very careful about it. There are certain situations where it makes perfect sense. A one-player game, like The Beast, for example, you're going to be doing some creation and resolution because you're the only player. And that game, which I really like, is very carefully designed to make the result as not boring as possible. So think about system, and I encourage you to think about it in a very broad way that includes the people that are actually engaging with the activity. Think about what happens when and who gets to decide. Now, I should point out that it's okay not to define everything. Sometimes the things that you don't define are the most important, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So, like I said, the rules, how do you roll the dice? What are your character's statistics? These are just a little piece of it, and frankly, often a very, very small piece. These rules tend to inspire as much as they constrain. And here's a quote from Vincent Baker, who you may have heard from earlier today, or maybe you'll hear from tomorrow. He's a very smart person. He said the purpose of a game's rules is to supplant the group's default interactions, which I think is just great. That's so smart, because you and your friends know how to do something. You know how to achieve things. You know how to be creative together and have fun together. So when you overlay rules on top of what you and your friends already know, which is of course part of the system, they're going to provide you with a new set of interesting constraints and inspirations. So that Baker guy, who you're going to hear a lot from in this talk, he coined a term called the fruitful void, which I really like. I mentioned emergence a little while ago, the idea that emergent things can happen and that analog games, tabletop games, are very good at handling those things. Well, The fruitful void is a term that defines the things that your rules are not directly addressing that are emerging from play. So if you're familiar with some of these games, you'll recognize this. My Life with Master, which is all about defiance. It's about defying an unreasonable and evil master. It doesn't have a stat that tells you how good you are at defying the master. The Mountain Witch, which is a game all about honor, doesn't have an honor score. There's no way to gauge heroism or player ingenuity in Dungeons and Dragons, but D&D is all about player ingenuity and being a hero. In Vampire, it's a game about why you continue to exist and also why you are cool. And those are not things that have numbers attached to them. Those are things that are sort of part of the emergent about-ness. They're part of the fruitful void. And I think that's a beautiful way to think about games. There's no sexism resistant trait in Night Witches, but it's a game about defying endemic sexism. So in my last talk, I challenged you as a designer to define what your game's about, how it's about that, what players do and what characters do. And these are just reframing these questions, right? What's your job? What do you do when I'm playing the game? What am I supposed to be doing? This is a really important thing, and it's easy to forget about it. But somebody who is interacting with your game and doesn't know you might not know, or if they do know, they might know the wrong thing. I saw this happen a lot when Apocalypse World first came out, and Apocalypse World had some really different assumptions about what you do and what your job is. But it's a game that also is pretty flexible, and it works okay if you completely misunderstand the principles that drive the game. You can run an Apocalypse World game just the same way you run Dungeons and Dragons. And it won't be that fun, but it will be functional because it's pretty robust. And tons of people kind of missed the message and ran it the way that they run Dungeons and Dragons, with a game master who's in charge and is providing adversity and asking players to react to their plot. And that is the antithesis. It's the opposite of what Apocalypse World wants you to be doing. That's not your job as a GM in Apocalypse World, but it's easy to misunderstand. So if you don't tell people what their job is, they're going to assume that they know because they've played other games, and they'll be wrong. So your game's mechanics should be tools telling your players or the people reading your game what their job is. And I think that that's super important to remember, because if they're not, then they're going to make assumptions about what their job is. And the other question that people are going to ask is, how do I know if I'm doing it right? Well, the fruitful void is the answer to that, right? How do I know if I'm doing my job well? Well, if my game is about why do I continue to exist as an immortal in a world that doesn't want me, and you're addressing that in play and it becomes interesting, I think you're doing your job well. If you're playing the Mountain Witch and players are struggling with whether they need to do the honorable thing or the right thing, you're doing your job well. And the game supports that in both those cases. Let's talk for a second about feedback loops. And if you notice, each of these slides is building on the previous one. So we're going to see more about feedback loops as we move on here. So rules that connect in-game events with at-table events form feedback loops. So the at-table event is I roll to hit, and the in-game event is I stab the orc with my knife. So who did what? Well, the at-table event, where I roll to hit, that wasn't the character, that was the player. And the in-game event, I stab the orc with my knife, is the character, not the player. But there's a feedback loop there, right? Those two things absolutely depend on each other. And I think I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but I think that there's some interesting things related to feedback loops that have not been fully explored in game design. What happens when those get blurred? What happens when the character is doing some of the at-table work and the player is doing some of the in-game work? We can come back to that, but I think it leads to some weird things related to your agency as a player and what you get to have control over that I think are fun spaces for design. So a woman named Emily Carrot Boss coined a term called bleed. And I think this is a useful thing to know as a game designer. Bleed's when emotions bleed over from in one direction or the other. Your character feels sadness and loss. And as a player, you feel sadness and loss. You come to game night angry about something that happened at work, and your character is angry. That's bleed. Now, you see bleed, it's much more pronounced in LARP than it is in tabletop. It's almost unavoidable in LARP. And in tabletop, it's usually a little more subtle because there's more abstraction. But those feedback loops between player and character, they're supporting bleed. And as a designer, you can certainly emphasize it. You can certainly grow it and cultivate it. Excuse me. I'm going to take a drink of water. Or you can try to minimize it as a design choice. You can try to reject bleed, but it's still going to happen. And you need to be aware of that. And the fact that you have a real person who's agreeing to enter a fictional space as someone else, there's going to be empathy. They're gonna feel things, and you can't avoid that. And because you can't avoid it, you might as well be aware of it, and you might as well try to make it something valuable. So those feedback loops often are reward cycles, right? And they can motivate players to do what you want your game to be about. This is social engineering. This is the real guts of what we do as game designers, right? We want to create situations using the tools that we have to change the conversation at the table, to get people to be motivated to do the things that you want them to do. If you want them to explore a dungeon, there's a feedback loop related to experience, treasure, and killing monsters that's going to push players of Dungeons and Dragons in the direction of exploring dungeons and fighting dragons. And all games have this in one way or another. I use Fiasco as an example of a negative reward cycle, right? The real world and fictional feedback loops in Fiasco are encouraging you to create the most crazy, disastrous story that you can. It's flipping that script. It's reversing the traditional model and encouraging you to play to fail. That's what the game's about. It's about failure. Everything in the game is a series of reward cycles that motivate you to fail. And just as a side note, bleed can be its own reward. In Gray Ranks, the fact that you start to really empathize with and grieve with the characters you're playing is its own reward. So I like to think about who needs your game. I think this is a very valuable thing to ask. And you may not always have an answer, but sometimes you do. Maybe you're making a game that's just dumb. Fiasco is a dumb game. The people who benefit from it are people who need some cathartic release. They want to laugh. They want to thumb their nose at tradition, maybe. It's a different kind of game because it inverts all the things you're expected to do. It allows you to fail. Well, The person who needs that might be somebody who's just had a bad day, right? Or it might be somebody who genuinely wants to explore what failure means in a safe way. Maybe they've got a really high stakes life, and the fact that they can play someone who's completely screwing up is not only pleasurable, but actually helpful to them in some way. Maybe that's what they need. A lot of games I think you can look at and say, who's the person who really needs this? And you can design for them. And if you understand that, you can also understand how to communicate how they will know when it's delivering that promise. This is the end of my sort of designy talk, and the rest of this is examples from that sort of pull games out to look at them a little bit. But I wanted to leave you with the Nixon principle, which is that any role-playing game can be used to play Star Wars. This is another great thing to challenge me on in the Q&A, because I would challenge you to name a role-playing game that you couldn't use to play Star Wars, and we'll see what happens. Maybe you can find one. I can't. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different things that you can do. Now, you can play with authority, and this means who gets to say what when, who's in charge, who has credibility, which is probably a better word for this. And this entire talk is really predicated on things that Vincent Baker has thought very deeply about and said. And I know that he has moved from talking about authority to talking about credibility, and I respect that. But let's talk about this more generally. You can, what are things you can do as a game designer with this? Well, you can atomize it. You can break it up. So when you play Dungeons and Dragons, you have a game master and players with very different asymmetrical responsibilities. You can make a game that has make a game that has complete parity among all the players, everyone having the same authority, responsibility, credibility at the table. Fiasco is a game that does that. You can also make a game that has no central figure in charge, but where players have different levels of authority or responsibility. This is all about who does what and who says what. There's also the terms here get a little fuzzy. GM-less is a very popular term. To say a game is GM-less just means usually that there is no central person who is in charge. But that might actually be GM full. Maybe everybody at the table has the same authority and gets to make decisions about the game. I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. GM-less is the most common term. And I can see how there are differences, but we'll just use GM-less as a convenient placeholder. How about thinking about mechanics that directly face the players? Who gets to create the world? Who gets to build it? Who has authority over which pieces of it? Can we create situations or entire campaigns and worlds where the players are building all that? No, of course we can. Games like Apocalypse World do that, and they do it very well. But there are a million ways to do this, and I'm excited about talking about many of them. The idea of building things through lists. The game In a Wicked Age presents you with a series of really evocative lists, and you're building the whole world through it, either by randomly rolling on those lists or by just picking the ones that make the most sense. This is an idea I stole out of whole cloth for Fiasco. You can see the idea of lists there, which create the framework for play, the setup. And that's also some busy work that has to be done, but it's also playful and fun. Some games that do this really well, I think, Archipelago is a game that I really love. And when I talk about, in my previous talk, I mentioned choosing frameworks to build out from when you're designing games. that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can start from a place that you know. Archipelago is the place that I know. Many of my game designs begin in Archipelago. And it plays around with authority in really fun ways. So in Archipelago, everybody owns a piece of the setting. You decide as a group what the most important things are. If we were playing an Archipelago game that took place after the apocalypse, maybe one of the most important things would be old technology. Well, if we make that decision, every time we play, one of the players is in charge of old technology. And whenever it comes up, we can all turn to that person and say, how does this work? Describe it to us. Tell us more about this old technology. And it's just brilliant. It's a wonderful way to handle that. Companion's Tale is a beautiful game that does a similar thing with characters. You play companions to a hero. Nobody really plays the hero. And all those companions have their own sort of destinies and ownership in really fun, interesting ways. So playing in ways that are very focused or very structured, right? Play games that have an ending. Your game doesn't have to make the default assumption of many traditional role-playing games, which are that play lasts essentially forever. D&D, you could play it forever, and some people do. And that's not a bad choice, but it is definitely a choice. It's also possible to play games that only last an hour, or only last 4 hours, or only last 5 sessions, or games that have an endpoint that you know before you even start. The Fall of Magic is a great example of this. The game's going to end when you reach the end of the world. You're going to reach the place where magic was born and magic is dying. And when you get there, you're either going to fix it and magic will return to the world, or you're not. Either way, the game is going to end. Dialect is a beautiful game that is specifically about language and how languages grow and die. It's incredibly focused, and you create a beautiful world. You create a whole language around this world, and that's what the game's about. It's not about anything under the sun. It's about language, and I think that that's super interesting. It's a super fascinating way to focus play and to structure play, and the fact that the two people who designed Dialect are very excited about language shines through. Well, you're probably excited about something weird too, and you can make a game that is just about that. I would love to see games that are just about knitting or just about, I don't know, building boats. I think that there's room for that in the world. How about games where we're not a bunch of people working together all the time? Starcrossed is a great example of this. It's a 2-player game. It's a game about romance. It's about 2 people who really, really want to, but they really, really shouldn't. It's a game that encourages, supports, and manages bleed really well. Monster Hearts, it's a game where everybody's going to have their own character and they're all going to be in the same place, but they definitely have their own agendas. And we're not all going to be working together to accomplish some goal. Our goals might be to defeat each other, which I really appreciate. It's a wonderful game. And in my opinion, it's probably the clearest and best example of the Apocalypse World engine. Apocalypse World itself not excluded. It's a lovely game. So a game text is an instructional text. I feel this really strongly. Other people disagree. That's okay. This entire talk is predicated on things that I think are smart, either that other people have said or that I believe. And I think that your game rules, your game instructions for play are just that. They're instructions. If you want to learn how to change the carburetor in your car, you're going to go to a manual that is an instructional text. I don't really think at their heart that game texts are any different. They can be beautiful, they can be lyrical, they can be interesting and fun to read, they can do other things, but at their heart, they've got to tell you how to change the carburetor. So that said, there are many ways to do that. You don't necessarily have to have a book with numbered paragraphs that you follow one at a time that tell you how to play the game. That works. That's the oldest model in existence, but there are others that work great. For the Queen is a beautiful game that tells you how to play it as you read it. You can set the game down, and you're turning over cards that tell you how to play the game without any preamble, without any instruction. You just start playing, and the game teaches you what it's about. I think that's great. Swords Without Master is a wonderful game that is sort of I don't want to say the opposite of that, but you can sit down with Swords Without Master and immediately start playing in a similar way. But if you're looking for a game that is a genius implementation of the game as instructional text, For the Queen is the game I would recommend looking at. So thinking about clarity and precision, the idea that you are going to write your instructional text in a way that is functional, that is readable, and that is actionable, right? Ideally, if it's really good, it's also going to have modularity and extensibility, meaning that there are pieces you can take out or put back in, and pieces that you can instantly see ways to hack, to extend, to change. And I can also give some examples here of games that present or deliver in different ways. So Apocalypse World, and I keep harping on Apocalypse World because it's such a good game, and the people who made it are very talented. It does a lot of these things. It was designed intentionally to degrade gracefully, meaning that it's built sort of with layers of an onion. And if you don't do the outer layer of the onion, the inner layers of the onion will still function, all the way down to its very core, which is just a pretty simple die mechanic right at the center of the game. If that's all you've got, it's still going to work. You can continue to add to it, and it's still going to work. Eventually, you're going to get something much more complex and nuanced if you use the entire game. There's an explosion of games that are built off of the Apocalypse World framework precisely because of this. I wrote Night Witches using it because it's just a brilliant foundation that allows you to build onto it and to take things away to make it your own. Dogs in the Vineyard is a game that's really the mechanical piece of Dogs in the Vineyard that is so clear and so good is roll the dice or say yes or roll the dice. It tells you exactly what you should be doing as you facilitate that game. I love that about it. Dogs also has a wonderful Fruitful Void, right? There's no spiritual warrior stat. There's no religious belief stat in Dogs in the Vineyard, but it's really all about challenging your faith. I want to mention Dog Eat Dog because it's a game about colonialism. It's a very specific, focused game. And it immediately puts you in the right mindset because the very first rule in Dog Eat Dog is that you need to decide who is the colonial power. And you can think of a million ways how you and your friends could decide who has to play the colonizing power and who has to play the people being colonized. Maybe you could do it by hair color or who's tallest, right? There's lots, or roll dice for it. Well, Liam Luang Burke, the guy who wrote Dog Eat Dog, chose a different path. And he said, compare your income. Compare how much money you as players make. And the person who makes the most money is the colonizing power. Now, this is it's going to vary from culture to culture. And the only culture I really know is American culture. But that is the most uncomfortable conversation to have between a bunch of Americans, how much money you make. and it absolutely sets the tone. It makes you tremendously uncomfortable, and it also makes you a little distrustful of your friend who is more wealthy than you are. It's so brilliant. It's a wonderful thing. Thinking about ways to deliver games in unusual ways, Alexandra Santalska's game, The Beast, it's a single-player game you play over 30 days. I just think that's great. It's so interesting to me that she is using the passage of time as a component in the game, and it's lovely and horrible. It's a great game. So this last slide is just a grab bag for some things I wanted to talk about that didn't really fit anywhere else. I am exceptionally interested in the gray area between live action role playing and tabletop role playing. A lot of my work is happening in that area now. And I think that that's an exciting design space, because the things that LARP does really well involve things like empathy and bleed, which tabletop can handle, and that occurs, but not reliably. You have to kind of work for it or around it, whereas in LARP it's pretty organic. So bringing some of those techniques to tabletop are exciting to me. And also these definitions are blurry. Pardon me, these definitions are blurry. So you look at Jeep form games, for example, which come out of a very specific Swedish, Danish tradition. To them, those are tabletop games. Certainly to me, they look like LARPs. We're both right, you know. American freeform is a label that I actually don't use very much anymore for the sort of games that I'm making, which are, they have some game-like elements, but that are also live-action games. And at least in the States, our scene was hit by a bunch of Nordic LARP parallel traditions like Jeep form and the scenario tradition happening at Festival in Denmark, and bigger Nordic LARP games that really were very inspirational. And you see examples of their impact in our games still. We see a growing community of games around diceless and freeform games. You're probably familiar with Stalker. The tabletop role-playing game version of Stalker doesn't use dice. It's extremely interesting. It's pretty hardcore. You can compare that to The Quiet Year, which is a beautiful game that is also has no random elements to it. Well, that's not technically true. It does, but the randomness is not in the resolution of events. It's just in the order in which things occur. And it's a very small, quiet game. We are seeing, I guess it's pretty established now, the idea of the old school Renaissance, the OSR, using nostalgia for old methods of play as a way to innovate, which I think is interesting. It's not my scene. I don't understand it, but it's obviously leading to lots of success in people being excited about their things and sharing them in new and old ways that are really cool. And I have lots of respect for that. Companies like Goodman Games with Dungeon Crawl Classics seem to be capturing that lightning in a bottle in a really satisfying way. My favorite thing about Dungeon Crawl Classics is the funnel, the idea of starting your fantasy campaign with a dozen or a half a dozen absolutely useless zero-level characters and playing them all until you only have one survivor, which I think is just charming and great. And I list previous occupants here as an example of a hybrid LARP tabletop kind of design. It's a really good entry point for people who want to experience live action play. It's a really scary 4-person game that I love. There are other games that do this really well. I encourage you to check out the Golden Cobra competition, which is a freeform LARP competition that I'm involved in that is churning out hundreds of games that really embody this gray area. Some of them are more tabletop games. Many of them are more LARP-like games, but they're really very accessible and really fun. So tons of games that are pushing these boundaries, and I really encourage you to explore them. And that's my talk. Thanks very much. I think what we're going to do now is take a short break and come back for a question and answer session. So if there are things in this talk that interested you, I challenge you to write them down and then have a conversation with me about them. If you can think of a game that you couldn't play Star Wars with, I want to hear about it because I will prove you wrong. Okay, I'm going to go. I will see you in about 20 minutes.